Welcome to the 2024 Phish Studies Conference Video Archive. The Mockingbird Foundation is thrilled and proud to present this groundbreaking video series on our YouTube channel. It continues our tradition of celebrating music education. Since 1996, we have been an all-volunteer nonprofit organization dedicated to broadening access to educational opportunities for youth in music and the musical arts. Please visit mbird.org to donate today.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming into this cavernous auditorium. Feel free to move forward if you like. We got Alex holding down the front row up here. There is a rail if you would like to ride it. There are 4 rail positions available for you. Welcome, everyone, to the first sort of bread and butter, meat and potatoes sessions of the Phish Studies Conference 2.0. This is the first of 2 musicology music sessions. We've titled it The Shiny Music That Descends from Overhead. My name is Dr. Jake Cohen. I am an independent scholar from Brattleboro, Vermont. And I am not Dana Reason, who is listed on this panel. I'm sitting in for her today. Instead, we have 3 papers, just so you know how it's going to go. The papers will be 20 minutes long, and then after each paper, we will have 10 minutes for question and answer. If you would like to ask a question, because everything is being recorded and for accessibility reasons, please come down to one of the 2 microphones being Vanna Whited by Alex down here, and ask your question. And I encourage you to ask questions, and I will moderate the Q&As as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, you should go ahead and get started. We're going to start off with Julie Viscardi-Smalley. And Julie Viscardi-Smalley, DMA, is an associate professor in the Department of Sports, Entertainment, Event Management at Johnson & Wales University in Providence, Rhode Island. She teaches coursework related to the music industry and concert production while focusing her research on popular music analysis and music industry studies. Her paper today is called Like a Ship That's Run Aground, Pedal Point and Drone in the Music of Phish. Please join me in welcoming Julie.
Thank you, Jake. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this session today. So super excited to dive into some musical concepts with you today about regarding pedal point and drone in the music of Phish. We're going to take a look at the SPAC Piper, and if there's time, which there probably won't be, maybe the You Enjoy Myself from 12-103. So this was my About Me slide, but Jake, you covered it. Although in this, if you hadn't seen this earlier, this is me at Coventry. So in the spirit of Phish Studies 2.0, that's me in 2.0. On the rail. I'm like the short person. I let my tall friends run, and I just carry the bags and get there. All right, so today we'll be exploring the use of pedal point for the most part, and we're going to contextualize pedal point. After defining it, we're going to contextualize it through the lens of something called expectancy theory. And hopefully, I know there's a lot of things happening here. Can you hear me? Thank you. All right. And so we're going to take a look at pedal point specifically through the Piper from SPAC in 2004, June 19. And ideally, we're kind of going to see how this jam is a little bit unique in the grand scheme of things. So first things first, what is pedal point? What is drone? As Phish fans, I know you know what these things are. We hear them all the time. And if you listen to any music that involves improvisation, you hear this all the time. Pedal point is basically a lengthy note, but it comes from the Western classical tradition of being played on an organ, and the term pedal literally comes from the use of the pedal on the organ to sustain a tone for a long time, generally in the bass or the lower pitches, and then there's usually different harmonic changes happening above the pedal. What's interesting, I think, for music theorists is to kind of do some analysis regarding what's the pedal note and then what's happening with the other pitches or harmonies happening above the pedal. And so we're going to kind of explore some of that today. The terms pedal, point, and drone do get kind of interchanged quite a bit. However, drone, I think, is used a bit more commonly if we're talking about kind of non-Western musical traditions. So that might be something interesting for us to just be aware of. Why do we use pedal, point, and drone? A few reasons, and some of them, are a little bit opposite. So we might be creating tension, which is what Phish does a lot. Or it provides stability through kind of a lengthy piece of musical material, or prolong a particular harmony for a length of time. And we're going to try to see how Phish does both of these things. Here's some examples right off the bat that I think we all know. So we're going to just listen to just a moment of Studio Billy Breathes, and here's some pedal. Hope I got this in the right place. This might be loud. We'll see. That's really loud. That's okay, yeah. That's the pedal right there on the bottom. Hear how Paige just dun 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 dun. It's on that pitch. If you're listening to what Paige is doing above, right, we've got all sorts of harmonies going on above the pedal. So that's a pretty classic example of pedal point in a studio. All right, and in free, we hear it here at 156. So it's kind of an interesting pedal, the donut, donut, right? It's broken up. It's not one held pitch, but it's implied that that's the pedal across much of the end of free there, and then through any free jam that we hear. So those are some examples, real quick, to get us kind of on the same page. And let's talk for a moment about expectancy theory. This isn't the most pretty slide. It's just to share a few quotes, right? And I think this is particularly relevant to us as Phish fans. So expectancy theory is this theory that it came from actually decision-making, research and decision-making in business. But in music, it's been applied to the notion of listeners approaching the listening experience with expectations. Now, we come into any music listening with expectations, right? Because we're kind of steeped in musical traditions, right? So we kind of have an idea of the ways certain chords might resolve. We have ideas about the way a pop song might progress, right? Now, in terms of kind of Phish, right, we have this author, Vujovic, and their work through 2017 and 2019 is pretty interesting because they focus on how listeners acquire meaning relative to their surrounding pitches and or the musical traditions in which they lie. So as listeners of Phish especially, we have gotten used to certain melodies and harmonies. We know, kind of what to expect when we hear a certain song start. And we also kind of do what Meyer, at the bottom there, this last little bullet point says, we have an emotional reaction or response to that music, especially if we are already knowledgeable about that piece of music, right? I tend to believe this. So anyway, Vucevic says that, they don't talk about Phish, but they say that we have experiential knowledge of stylistic norms. I would say we have a lot of experiential knowledge of the stylistic norms across the Phish repertoire, right? We know it so well. And so if you know Piper and you've heard Piper jams, this one does stand out as a little bit, unique. Who knows this back Piper already? Anyone else got it on repeat in their car like me? Right? So we got to think about what would we expect from a Piper jam, and is it now that we expect a SPAC Piper? Can we top the SPAC Piper? Has this changed Pipers forever? Existential questions for us to consider, but Phish fans are likely to engage in what Hepakovsky and Day contend, which is that we might be versioning. We might be comparing multiple versions of the songs that we hear and the jams that we hear, right? I don't know about you, but I have my favorite jams, and now when I hear a certain piece, I'm like, oh, are you going to go there where you went in like 96? I really want to hear that, or whatever it is, right? So if you combine that expectancy with the emotional response that it often garners, then it's an interesting kind of parallel to make when we're considering the music of Phish. All right. Oh, and then this one little snippet that I added in while I was on the plane, reading an article where Margulis was quoted, and they broke down these expectations into ones that are either surprise or denial, right? And I thought denial was very relevant to us. I mean, think back to when, you wanted Phish to do something and they didn't. You were like, Carini's gonna happen, and it's like, Thunderhead, and love them both, but it's like we have expectations, or like you're just so used to listening to a jam, and it segues into another song, and you're just so used to hearing that when it does something different, you're like, oh, interesting. So with the SPAC Piper, I think it's worth considering all of these things. We have a pedal tone being used throughout the jam that changes throughout the jam, but I think it kind of messes with our expectations of what we might generally hear with a Piper jam. So let's give some context to this piece of music. We're in summer tour of 2004. This is the third show of the tour, as Jake was saying earlier, the better half of the tour, or when it was a little bit cleaner, right? And so we're in the second set. We're second song of a 5-song set. That's just some Piper stats as of today. Now, the whole Piper track is 32 minutes and 39 seconds. So it's a lengthy one in the grand scheme of things. And so what I've done is, if you were here earlier, I had pulled up a kind of a timeline, if you will, of the jam. Hopefully folks can kind of see that. My notes are not totally relevant, but I think it will help us to kind of just visualize what we're talking about. So I'm going to start us off with the jam. Let's see. Am I going to minimize this? All right, and we're at roughly 3 minutes and 31 seconds. It might be annoying because I'm going to be toggling this kind of back and forth. So we start out in the key of G, very typical for a Piper jam. And we start to hear these kind of like hints at pedal tone right away. So we're going to hear this held G in the guitar, and he holds it again. And it's just kind of this constant return to the tonic. And that's interesting with pedal point because the tonic is the first note of a scale and is kind of considered your foundational note, one of your foundational notes if you're improvising. And so it's almost like this anchor that keeps pulling the band, back to the pedal throughout the jam in different contexts. So let's get started and hear the beginning of this, and then I'll hop around in the interest of time. Right away, long pitch. It's not atypical to hear Trey do that, but in the context of this jam, I thought it was worth pointing out because we end up with so many long-held sustained tones later on in the jam. So I'm going to fast forward in the interest of time, and we're just going to kind of see a few little snippets from the beginning of this jam. I'm going to go to 6 minutes and 4 seconds, if I can. 6 minutes and 5 seconds. And we're just going to hear just a little bit of how this has evolved, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this part of the jam. We're going to fast forward to where it gets more pedally. This 3-note motif by Trey, and it's just these long pitches are kind of the most, I guess, saleable takeaway. In a traditional Piper jam. So what I'm going to do is hop over to kind of the 12-minute mark here, and we're going to hear kind of the beginnings of the pedal points that they get into. Let's see. Good enough. And then as we go through here, this is really kind of where at 13 minutes and 8 seconds, we're really going to hear kind of this this G pedal note in the bass. So we're going to hear kind of just like a focus in the lower pitches that we hear just on this one note. And we've got Trey outlining these chords, a G minor 6/4 chord and a G sus 4 chord, and he is just doing these kind of like arpeggios over the pedal. So it's interesting to think about the notes that he's choosing to use over the pedal. So we'll kind of hop in here. We can turn it up a bit too. That's cool. Do I have the power to do This is where it changes. Your mic on the pedal. And the page. Well, lower page. Almost a bass bump. I think I put that in my notes. Okay, this is where the chords start right here. I encourage you to be listening for Fishman around 13:53. The drums are going to come up in the mix. We're going to establish the new tempo, and we're going to kind of like establish the new groove. Still that same note on the very, very bottom. We approach 14 minutes and 30 seconds. You're going to listen for this out of nowhere, almost this A pitch. Rob, you can play an A over there. Which doesn't make sense right now. This is where I turn it up in my car, at least. So it's really, what I find interesting about as we kind of like moved there is that, you know, it was, if you really listen to kind of what they're doing, you know, they're kind of fishing around to meet on the same pitch, right? And if you heard the earlier listening session, we were talking a lot about that, how like sometimes you can just hear them talking to one another musically to find the right pitch, right? So this move to A minor took them into kind of another section of this jam. But it's interesting because if you really think about what they're doing, there's a lot of just playing the same note over and over and over again, but it's just, you know, the way that they're able to kind of get the groove around it is what's impressive about it. So let's see. I think Jake told me 3 minutes or so ago. I have 5 minutes. So kind of what I ended up doing, just to give you an overview, is I outlined the whole piece here. And then we kind of end up with out here, in minute 21, it's like, is this even still Piper, right? Because we start getting into this tweezer reprise vibe. So, and that starts back here, you know, it's kind of around, back up in this section, around 14 minutes, we have this tweezer-esque motif hovering around the notes E and A, right? And so they start to bring that groove kind of into our consciousness there. And as we end, it's very much in the spirit of tweezer, although they're in a different set of notes, right? They're doing A, B minor, C, D, where tweezer reprise would be D, E minor, F, G. So it's, you know, fitting into the key center that they've established. So I'm just going to go ahead, fast forward. We'll check it out. tonic-ish chord. Yeah, so anyway, the notions here, and there's obviously a lot more if anybody, wants a copy of, the long jam chart, I'm happy to share. But it's, the idea is that this jam is a little bit different in the whole, kind of like Piper canon, and it gives us a glimpse into what a jam focused on pedal point is like, because it's one of the strategies that they use to make this a really interesting one. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. If anyone has questions, please come down to the microphones. You can just line up behind them. There's one here and one here. If anyone would like to come down to ask Julie a question, we'll do about 10 minutes of Q&A or so now, or listen to the rest of it. One question that I have for you is, I'm curious about the difference between, or the way that you are constructing this idea of pedal point as different from a one-chord jam, right? Like, why invoke? And this might be a little devil's advocate of me, so I apologize if it's comes off that way. But I'm curious, sort of like, where
I
is
know
there
what you're
is there an epistemological difference? Is there a specific musical difference, or is there a interpretive difference?
I don't think there's as much difference. I would actually say the one-note jam is in the spirit of pedal point, right? Like, I feel like that's where my analysis lies. The author, his name is escaping me, but there's an author who wrote kind of I don't know if it was a thesis or a dissertation about Genesis, the music of Genesis, and he does talk about the resting on one chord in the context of pedal point. So that was one inspiration from the literature. But I actually think that, the one chord is a modern version of what we might consider pedal point from kind of like the Western classical music canon. So I feel like that's where I'm centered. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's? No.
I like that. I very much like that idea, and I wonder if there are certain classical associations with the pedal point. Like I'm thinking, sort of the famous pedal point, the topic of the pedal in Western music history. And when we talk about topics, we're talking about like sort of signification that the entire listening culture at the time would have recognized. It tends to bring images of the pastoral. You think of the opening to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, that big F pedal at the beginning of Beethoven's Sixth. So, and throughout Western music history, the pedal has a way of signifying the pastoral or the dance or like the country, and I don't think Phish does that, but I think
it's more organic.
Yeah, but I think there's also things like James Brown is a one chord jam, right? Yeah. And this is not a funk jam. This is Phish. This is like not a Phish funk jam either. It's just Piper, but yeah.
There. Hello. Anyway, on the tweezer piece, normally when they do something like that in the middle of a jam, it's a response or an inside joke, or it's a commentary on the tweezer that sucked the night before, or what happened to the tweezer reprise. Was there something in that show or the night before that suggested that they had that tweezer on the brain?
I don't think so, because it was the next night. Let's see. I'm on the wrong one. I don't think there was anything. I was hoping they would jump into it, but they didn't. They went into got Jaboo.
Don't say it like that.
That's what I don't expect at shows. I'm always like, oh, bathroom. Sorry. Got a Jaboo fan. I know. And then, let's see. Yeah, I think maybe it was I don't have Phish.net up, but I think it was, where are you? Over there. Yeah, I don't remember there being, because I always want to hear Tweezer. Like, they could play it every night, and I'm good. And, I don't think, was it the next night? Do you guys remember?
I think it was the next night was like it was a 4-song second set. There was a Ghost, a Twist, a Yem. Maybe they didn't play Tweezer. I don't know. Has anyone got Phish.net up?
I got it.
Give us a...
I got it.
Anyway, maybe they didn't because they played it the night before. It was the Jay-Z night, right? They played it in the first set of the Jay-Z show, 618.
I should remember that. Let's see.
Anyway.
And he wasn't happy with it.
Yeah.
He wasn't happy with it, that's why he brought it back.
There we go. Yeah. Right.
I mean, I think it was actually just, in this one, I hear it as just, they found themselves into a 4-chord ascending idea, and all Trey had to do was,
And they do it a lot.
They do
Like,
that.
it happens all the time, but,
they're going like,
yeah, if there is an inside joke, we don't know it, I guess. But
yeah, go for it. And actually, I think he may have turned it off. So we'll just... I'll turn them on. I'll preload them next time.
The Hampton 20.
Got it.
If anybody remembers the Hampton 2018 Walk Away, that's another good example of how this exact figure morphs. That was
Walk Away has
fantastic.
taken on a tweezer reprise quality
Yeah.
since 2010, but
It's
that's
hard to avoid
That's
that
a different
riff.
paper.
And that's
little
good,
bit.
like the one from Hampton reminds me of this, the way
Yeah.
they did this
Yeah.
one, yeah.
My question, something that I've gotten very interested in, is how they actually work through kind of the modulations in a big jam like that, where they get from, the Grateful Dead would sit in G forever.
Yeah.
If they did a modulation, it was usually planned, the End of Eyes of the World or something, versus Phish will cycle through kind of randomly, it seems. They'll sit in G forever, and then all of a sudden they'll go minor, or they'll go up to the A minor, and the one you showed. I'm curious if you've got any thoughts on kind of who leads those movements in the band, if it's always the same, if they're following scale patterns that work out.
Yeah.
How do they find their way from one to the next so smoothly?
It's a great question that you ask, and I think every jam that we have analyzed today, I feel like it's a different person leading the way. In this particular one, and maybe in 2004 in general, we were actually just talking about this. Like Trey is kind of like, even though I was like at the time, like Trey, you're fine, pull through, and he was kind of like lagging, and oftentimes
It's
the last one to join, and Mike
is the one
often
who's
leading.
Yeah. And Mike is also the one, notably in 2004, who was like, "We shouldn't stop. We're still fine." So.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it varies too. Like even like listening to all the Birds of a Feathers that we were, listening to. Sometimes it's just, Paige will play something off the wall, and then eventually he'll stick with it sometimes, and they might follow him too. So.
Well, join me in thanking Julie once again for a great presentation. Okay. Before I introduce our next presentation, I do have one little PSA for everyone. In the lobby, right by where you came in from registration, you'll find Amanda from the All That Jam podcast, and she's here to talk with all of you about your experiences here at the conference. Take 5 to 10 minutes to find her and record your feelings about the event, what you're seeing and hearing, and anything else you'd like to share. She will be here, she'll be there tomorrow as well. So if you're still feeling like super positive and really excited, like go talk to her right away. If you want to get a little jaded first, maybe wait till tomorrow, whatever you like. But Amanda from the All That Jam podcast, please take 5 to 10 minutes to find her and give her your thoughts. Okay. Up next in this session, we have Blake Emidy. Did I pronounce your last name correct?
Yes, you did.
Great.
Thanks.
Blake Emidy. Blake is an assistant professor of public administration and policy at the University of Montana. His research looks at the organizational factors that contribute to employee motivation and well-being in the public sector. His presentation today is called "What Does It Mean to Be Completely Free? Environmental Constraints as Musical Inspiration During a Phish Show." Please join me in welcoming Blake.
And thanks, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I hope you understand by now that I will not be talking about how federal employees don't like their jobs, which is my normal spiel. So you guys get a topic I like talking about just a teensy bit more. And you might wonder what public administration or my parent field of study, sort of organization theory, has to do with Phish, especially when you consider the fact that Phish is often, by people who don't understand it, characterized as a band that, urinates in the ears of their fans is the phrase, but that would imply that they can do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, with no real attention towards things like song length, how long it needs to be, things like song structure, how far things can veer off course, and how long a set can be, whether that's 4 songs, which we all enjoy, or 14 songs, which, it has a time and a place, but maybe not every set too. All of these things would be ignoring a lot of the demands that Phish actually has to acknowledge and respond to during your average Phish show. So first of all, if you were at a show and no one ever really boos Phish anymore, things range from positive to less positive, let's be real. But if you were to hear A Life Beyond the Dream, followed by Drift While You're Sleeping, followed by More, you might, with all of those things right in a row, you might not really enjoy how that show is going, and whatever new rating system we end up finding, it'll probably be pretty low in the rankings. There are also things like curfew and how much the band could be fined for getting past it. I feel like I talk about that every time I go to a Phish show in Atlanta or New York or somewhere that has sort of strict curfews. We have expectations around how they jam and the types of jams that they'll actually engage in. So the phrase, not another one of those positive major key bliss jams again. It's not that they're bad, it's just that you can't just do that as the band. We need some sort of variation in those jams. And finally, and this is an important rule that they absolutely should not break, there shouldn't be any song repeats during a particular run in a particular place, even if it's 13 shows that they're doing at that place. So all of this, whenever I see these sorts of expectations that we place on the band and their need to be acknowledged in order for the band to be effective, I think back to my home discipline of organization theory and wonder, how does organization theory inform how the band responds to these demands? First, I should give you a little primer on what the hell organization theory even is. It's essentially the study of how organizations structure their activities and navigate their external environment. And that's a key, crucial sort of term for this presentation. The external environment is essentially anything outside the bounds of an organization. So it can be competing organizations. It can be the government that sets laws around how they can behave. It can be the consumers or clients or beneficiaries of a product or service. All of these things compose the external environment of an organization. Some of the common questions they ask are how we maximize effectiveness and efficiency, how the external environment plays a role in decisions, and how do some organizations thrive while others die. And there are some famous thinkers here. We'll actually be focusing mostly on Herbert Simon as well as Jeffrey Pfeffer and Gerald Solancic. And again, we're trying to use what these people have thought of previously to understand how Phish sort of creates set lists, conducts jams, and makes decisions on stage effectively. So what the hell do these people have to do with Phish? Actually, it turns out Jeffrey Pfeffer could be a page in a cover band pretty darn easily. I don't even need to point to which one it is. Herbert Simon is also the person who's going to be helping us, and he could be Fishman, I don't know. But worth noting, Herbert Simon was also, in addition to being a professor of everything, including computer science and public management, was also an accomplished pianist. So did have some knowledge of music and improvisation. So we start with Pfeffer and Solancic and the idea of environmental constraints. So again, like I told you, organizations have their bounds around or beyond their bounds, competitors, regulators, collaborators in the form of other organizations. They also need to acquire resources, whether those be financial resources or human resources. And they also need to be sensitive to the needs of clients, consumers, and beneficiaries. And this part's important because when we talk about an effectiveness of an organization, for instance, if I were to tell you later tonight, I kicked this presentation's ass, I was so good, and then the three people who are listening to all say like, I probably wasn't very effective because they define how effective I am. And in the same way, Phish's fans are the determining factors for whether or not they're effective over time. If they're not effective, people will stop coming to shows, and then they have harder times getting resources. So it's important to pay attention to clients and beneficiaries. These things all produce constraints that limit how the organization can behave. Phish couldn't all of a sudden one day decide to become a rap group. for a number of different constraints that are both normative as well as constraints on who they are as people and musicians. It makes it to where you can't just do anything. A lot of the decisions that you make as an organization will be constrained by things in the external environment. We typically think of these constraints as being undesirable, and yet we also don't want Phish to be a rap group in a lot of instances. There are lots of constraints that reveal which options are realistic for us to take, and based on the time and resources available to us. We want to think about what the client or what the consumer wants or what the fan wants out of something. And oftentimes, when we have a smaller menu of potential options on how we can do something, it prevents something called paralysis by analysis. Has anyone ever heard of that? All right, just a little bit, yeah. It's essentially like going to a Ben & Jerry's scoop shop and having 40 different ice creams with multiple different sundaes versus just having 3 flavors to choose from. You might want those 40 flavors, but if time is a consideration, you might just be better off and feel better in the end about only having 3 options at your disposal. So what the hell does this have to do with Phish again? Let me weave back in. There are 3 different categories of constraints that I would consider Phish as having to navigate. And I think that they're better for them rather than worse for them, even though they can be limiting at times. The first one is temporal constraints. So things like set length, things like show length, things like when curfew is, things like weather impacting a particular set depending on how these pavilion shows shake out sometimes in the summer months. These things provide order, structure, and what I call the good kind of predictability. Honestly, I think it's more something like when Benji Eisen was talking about tradition, maybe the good kind of tradition. Like we know that there will be 2 sets and an encore. We know that the jam vehicle typically falls somewhere at the beginning part of set 2. We know that certain songs fall where they should sort of fall. So it allows the band to sort of experiment within those constraints and make more effective decisions rather than having this blank slate where they have to recreate an entirely different show devoid of previous expectations beforehand. Musical constraints, which I'm actually going to let my colleagues talk a little bit more about in detail because I am not the musicologist here, but there are constraints around how we play. I think, RJ, you might have mentioned during one of the Birds of a Feather that they went from C minor to G flat major during a jam at some point. They got around to it. Well, you can't go directly from those things without it sounding really, really jarring and being really unpleasant to the ear. So in a lot of ways, they adhere to constraints of Western music as a means of having a more pleasant sort of musical experience for the listener, and also having sort of the communication styles necessary that aren't verbal to actually be able to stay on the same page with one another. It's worth noting any of the breakages of these rules or these breaches of rules create excitement when they happen at certain times for certain reasons and kind of in an unpredictable, exciting way. So it's not as though these are things that they can't break. It's just things that they shouldn't break very often because it would ruin the excitement of the times where they do break them. And then there are normative constraints, which is the expectations that we all have about how the band should perform. And again, this is to ensure that the band remains effective. Fans demand unpredictability, again, the good kind. Here I would actually call this what Benji was calling innovation. We want the good kind of innovation rather than innovation all the time without regard to whether it's warranted or well-placed. And ultimately, when we think about fans' demand for these sorts of things, it keeps the band on their toes. And also, our reception of this music, which again, at a show, it's never negative. It can be negative on Phish.net, but I have my doubts as to whether or not they're reading that all the time. Positive or less positive receptions of a performance will inform what they do in future performances. So in a lot of ways, we think of these constraints as being harmful on face value, but really, temporal, musical, and normative constraints are necessary for Phish to do an effective job on stage. Speaking of set lists, I want to talk about how they make decisions, and I never thought we would have anything in common in terms of our presentations, but I do a whole lot with expectancy theory, and we're going to talk about another decision-making theory called bounded rationality when we look at how the band goes about creating set lists. For reference, this is my first show, and there were some major constraints in the form of a damn near tornado that made them divide Mound in half, ending in the first set and beginning again in the second set. So Herbert Simon, who's, again, just this outrageously prolific thinker from the 20th century, he described and ultimately refuted a model of fully rational decision-making. And apologies to any economists in the room, but fully rational decision-making isn't really something that's grounded in reality. Under a fully rational decision-making model, Trey would need to do a few things, and he can't. First of all, he needs to consider every single song they've ever performed, plus songs that are ready but yet to debut. After that, he needs to anticipate the outcomes and utility associated with each song choice in a particular spot on the set list. So not only is he going through every song, he's going through every song multiple times. He needs to rank order his preferences within each song slot across both sets, meaning that he knows he wants to open up with AC/DC Bag first, but if that were to fail, he knows he likes Down with Disease second, and Drift While You're Sleeping 56th in terms of his preferences. And then once that perfect list is compiled, and this is key, you cannot deviate from that list. It was sort of handed down from rational gods to tell you what the perfect way to do this is. Obviously, this is not what Trey does, and we can talk about this later. He gave an interview on Sirius XM where it's actually more of a process of ritual, preparation, and abandonment that I'd be happy to expand on later in the Q&A if desired. But what that process of ritual, preparation, and abandonment more looks like is what Simon would refer to as bounded rationality. We can't ever have all of the information about what songs we could possibly play, what the utility associated with each of those songs are, and how they would play out in a particular set, in a particular song slot. So instead, what we want to do is cut out some of that time-consuming decision-making processes by relying on things like experimentation and memory of what's worked well and what hasn't in the past. Relying on external information from other band members, from the audience, from the general vibes in the room, which of course Trey has actually mentioned quite a few times as informing song choices more than you would think. And thinking about things like habitual things. If something has worked in the past, why reinvent the wheel? Let's go back to these sorts of things in our set list creation or in our jamming style. And we try to predict what the consequences of a decision will be while acknowledging that we have incomplete information on those things. So whereas fully rational decision-making maximizes and tries to get the perfect decision, boundedly rational decision-making satisfices. It acknowledges that perfect decision is impossible, and it looks for things that tick enough of the really important boxes. So it's designed to save time and mental effort, although it is worth mentioning these sorts of things can put you in creative ruts. If we're relying too much on habit, we might be going to that Bliss jam at a time where the situation might have called for something more interesting or more innovative or more different. So it's worth mentioning that while satisficing is necessary, it can also lead to undesirable sort of decision making. And I think it's worth looking at a set list. So I plucked Friday the 13th in October at the United Center as sort of an example of how Phish sort of uses bounded rationality and satisficing to make decisions. And a couple examples that I would direct your attention to, first of all, are the set closers. I looked this up, and it's easy because they've only performed it like 29 times so far, but Drift While You're Sleeping has been played as a set closer or an encore closer 74% of the time. So to say that that's happening just by random chance simply isn't right. They're obviously anticipating the consequences of that uplifting sort of outro section as a good way to have love carry us through into set break, more or less. Harry Hood also, while it wasn't always this way, in 3.0 tends to end up bookending a set, or not even bookending, it tends to be at the end of a set, and usually set 2. Mountains in the Mist, on the other hand, almost never occurs at the beginning or end of a set. It's always somewhere in the middle, and it usually, as its cool down sort of nature suggests, is bookended by 2 higher energy, higher BPM songs. Foam is always played in the middle of, and this is actually interesting, almost always in the middle of set 1, very rarely happening in set 2, maybe as a decision where the band's, sort of fingers and dexterity are still in a place to play that highly technical song early on in the show. And then finally, one other thing is you see these lists of jam vehicles where there's a clear break where, or a clear sort of place at the end of the composed section where jams can take off. Those typically happen at the beginning of set 2 when the constraints on them are fewest. They're less likely to run up against the time limits like I am here right now. Before I get going, I think this is actually a pet project of mine and one that I want to bring out to the larger literature because I hate the way that Herbert Simon talked about docility. That is the worst term. It's the most gatekeeping sort of term to describe what is otherwise a relatively simple concept. Docility is essentially a way of learning and making better decisions that's marked by a stage of exploration and inquiry, followed by a stage of adaptation. It's akin to sort of teachability or the willingness to be taught or trained or gain information from other sources as we're trying to do something better. And Simon talks about the way you would operate a crane is you would talk to someone about it, you'd fiddle around with it for a little while, and then ultimately you'd be pretty decent at operating that crane. Docility is ultimately the crucial step, the crucial human concept for understanding how we make effective decision making. It helps us over time to more accurately anticipate the consequences of a decision. Feedback from that experimentation helps us to develop these habits, and then greater experimentation over time leads to better decision making that can take into account a lot of nuanced sort of contextual factors. And I think that this really relates well to Halloween 1996 and the way that they've talked a lot about how jamming has differed between 1995, where it was more technical, straight ahead, rocking, and certainly experimental, but in a different way. And then 97 is also marked by still a good amount of experimentation, but mostly with this sort of cow funk that we've ascribed to it. And Halloween 96 and Remain in Light was viewed as the sort of pivot point there. In an interview with David Byrne, Page said that Remain in Light helped them to incorporate more groove into their playing. And in this way, we can think of that 1996, the lead up to Halloween, as being that stage of exploration and inquiry, and then 1997 as being that stage of adaptation. So Simon has mentioned, as smart as he was, he couldn't figure out a better friggin' term for this thing. But I think that we should really look at this as sort of jamming, more or less. The idea that jamming involves a stage of exploration and inquiry, communicating with other people musically, trying to take risks and see what works well, followed by a stage of adaptation that uses that external information, that habit that you've built in, the memory of what works and what doesn't, while also relying on things like judgment, intuition, and serendipity to move a jam forward. So in a lot of ways, I'm trying to break down some of the gates that docility created by being just a stupid word that only academics understand, and bring this back to the masses in something that we might all know and understand better as jamming. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Blake. We have about 7 minutes or so for some questions. If you have a question, please come down to one of the 2 microphones that have been turned on now, and feel free to ask. In the meantime, I'm going to... Julie has a comment.
Okay.
Hi. Blake, awesome job. That was really cool to hear. And I wanted to, this is more a comment, it's not a question. It's interesting that Phish takes so many risks and other bands that improvise take so many risks because they're trying that out real time and they're getting that feedback real time, right? And so over time, it's like they realize what works, what doesn't, and they do return to some of those kind of either efficient kind of parts of a jam, right? And that's what made me think of the songwriting process too, right? So for a musician, when they're learning to play or writing a song, right, you kind of learn like what works and what doesn't, and what's efficient and what's not efficient. And it kind of, there's, you know, even if we consider the songwriting process, you know, why they make the decisions they make, it might be like, oh, well, when we're playing this live, this is going to work well because blah, 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 you know, or even just the key that they choose to put it in, right? He likes playing in this key more so than that key, for example. And a lot of their songs are in the same keys, not all of them, but I mean, you know, and some of them lead into other songs more often than not. So those are, it was cool to have you show us the stats too. I always appreciate that. And
thank you.
know, yeah.
No, I think that's, I mean, all of that is, you know, there are so many different dimensions in which these things like docility and like bounded rationality seep through the music creation process as well as the improvisational choices that I'd love to talk a whole lot more about, like what sort of things you were picking up on with it too. Thank you.
Hi. I love the similarity in the structure around decision making in both talks so far. You tend not to think of that as a real time thing, but when you were talking about working within the constraints, the first thing I'm thinking of is things like Twitter. I won't call it by its new name, which is, it started off as inherently very constrained. And then you talked about docility, which is, well, one of the things you can do is learn from people who are expert in it. One of the things that struck me is the things that we use the most, like hashtags and @ notation, were never invented by the Twitter people. They were invented by users who said, gee, this format sucks. Let's come up with something much more compact. So I was just wondering if you'd say more about this. Let's go focus on people who have gone this way before or who are expert in this field, because sometimes I think under constraint, the people who are less expert, will come up with a really creative way of solving the problem.
I love that the digital age kind of allows us to gain external information from other people. And I do think you're right that a lot of the savvy use of social media doesn't come bestowed by the tech companies. In a lot of ways, we still, think about, musicians in the room, think about when you were learning your instrument in 1995 versus what would happen if you would learn your instrument in 2022. Like the ideas of how you would go about acquiring information and the amount of YouTube videos you wouldn't versus would watch religiously to sort of learn how to play your instrument. That is sort of the process of docility there. And I think the tech has made it easier to gain a wider swath of information. And hopefully that's helped Phish to the extent that they do look at our stupid drug ban message boards. But
well, they stopped playing. Jennifer Dances.
They stopped playing Time Turns Elastic.
Time Turns Elastic, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, those are songs, pipe down. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Those are really good examples, I think, of fans being part of that feedback loop, and the band not having all the answers all the time on those.
And who knows how they got that information, but
Right.
it certainly seems to have gotten to them. And
Sure. Yeah. Sam, did you?
Hey, I'm Sam Gustin. Thanks. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk about the constraints or relative lack thereof in terms of different venues. Like, so for example, you've got Madison Square Garden in the biggest city in the world, the #1 venue in the biggest city in the world. On New Year's Eve, there's a lot of attention. You've got Sphere, you've got the attention of the national press. And then in a couple months, we've got them playing in the middle of the week on a college campus in St. Louis University for 2 nights in the middle of the week on a college campus in a venue that holds 10,000 people. And so I'm wondering if there are any differences. Maybe a stage is a stage, but I thought maybe you could talk about that. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's difficult because sometimes I feel like they feel the need to deliver whenever there is more of an eye on them. Probably because, I mean, for every Madison Square Garden on New Year's Eve is not just a bigger arena, but there's also going to be a lot more people webcasting that too. So their audience is bigger, and it's probably going to put more pressure on them to sort of do something wild, and maybe not even New Year's as being the example that I want to do because there's always a gag there, but a December 28th is not the same as a June 15th at Chaffetz Arena or wherever that is. Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, and I did want to, I did not have time, but the Sphere introduced so many new constraints that the band has to pay attention to. The idea that they needed to...
Couldn't seg.
Yeah, no, they couldn't seg, and they needed to practice train wrecks, as they talked about, of, while they're never looking at Kuroda like, okay, you got to pivot with us wherever we go, we know that he can do that in a normal show. The visuals were so tied to the music and had to be so structured in a way that could move with them within reason, that they had to practice sort of deviations off course ahead of time, multiple times, in fact, if you listen to the CBS interview. So I think that Sphere, just as much as Tuesday night in Chaffetz, shows us that each venue has very, very unique constraints that they place on their performances.
Or quick question, if we can go there. Yeah, we can do that.
Hey, Kev, Hollow, Blake, thanks so much. Where do the self-imposed constraints fit into your? And I'm thinking of coming up and suddenly Trey's playing the mini kit, and rotation jams or any of these efforts, the introduction of new instruments, or relinquishing control of where something might go. Where does the self-imposed, thinking of docility, and where do those fit in?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and one that, frankly, I haven't wrestled with as much as the externally imposed constraints. But I think that this can go two different directions. There can be internal constraints based on physical ability or intellectual knowledge to do something, or internal constraints based on sort of pressures from band members to behave in a particular way. And I find that second part way more fascinating, and it's something that I would need to do a little bit more research on, how the band is communicated about their expectations around how each member should perform their role. That could be a really interesting follow-up to that. Thank you.
Let's thank Blake once again for his great paper.
Thank you so much.
Okay. And the third paper on our session today is by Rob Collier. Rob Collier is Associate Professor of Music Theory at Alverno College in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He took a 19-year hiatus from Phish between 1999 and 2018, which he notes is a 506-show gap, and he is happy to be back on the train. His paper today is called Imitating or Counterpointing, Listening to Phish Through Mike Gordon's Bass Lines. Please help me in welcoming Rob.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you about Mike. In a largely off-the-cuff conversation as part of his What Are You Doing video series on Instagram, Trey Anastasio asked Mike Gordon to talk about the band's improvisational style. Gordon began his response by saying members of the band might be imitating each other or they might be counterpointing each other. He then briefly tried to think of a third category, but quickly gave up, summarizing the remaining possibilities as all varieties of that, from same to different. In the broadest sense, it's likely that those are the only two options: playing complementary or supportive musical ideas, imitating, or playing contrasting musical ideas, counterpointing. In this presentation, I'll examine Gordon's approach to Phish's shared improvisational language, first by identifying and defining some of his common methods of imitating and counterpointing, and then by providing specific examples of these methods as they occur in jams. Because the terms imitation and counterpoint already have precise musicological meanings outside of the way in which Gordon was using them, we could also think of these concepts as musical agreement and disagreement. So let's take a look at some of the things Mike does with relative frequency in a jam, beginning with what would qualify as agreement or imitation. The idea of agreement includes harmonic agreement as well as rhythmic or metric agreement. Harmonic agreement is when we hear Mike supporting a chord progression or tonal area implied by another band member. He usually does this by playing the root of each chord. Rhythmic or metric agreement entails playing rhythms that align with the basic groove of the jam. This often involves accenting the downbeat, the first beat of a measure, but could also include accenting other parts of the measure in unison with another member of the band. Agreement doesn't usually mean playing exactly the same thing as another band member. Often it involves playing complementary things. Strict mimicry is kind of taboo in Phish jams. Trey has said, mimicry is the lowest, most basic level of communication. The band, in fact, used to practice anti-mimicry exercises. And while they certainly don't use mimicry extensively as a way of building jams, band members will very often mimic short musical fragments played by another member. For instance, Mike might end a musical phrase on his bass with a three-note flourish. Trey might hear it and use that three-note flourish to begin his next phrase. It seems to be a way of checking in, saying, I hear you. It's a yes and in the musical conversation, rather than the band members simply parroting each other. Disagreement, like agreement, can appear in harmonic and metric forms. Harmonic disagreement often appears as a sort of harmonic denial, wherein Gordon hears a new chord progression implied by another member, but refuses to support it. For instance, Page often plays a 1-4 progression in a jam, or C to F if we're in the key of C. Mike has a choice to either play the C to F progression with Page, or to deny it, usually by just hanging on the C chord, not moving to F. Metric or rhythmic denial or disagreement may come in the form of syncopation, an avoidance of the downbeat, or generally playing rhythms that don't reinforce the groove. Metric denial can often result in a kind of harmonic denial. If Mike plays the root of the chord on the downbeat, like the first measure of this example, he is providing both harmonic and metric support. If he avoids playing on the downbeat, like in the second measure, it is essentially a metric denial. The consequence, though, is a weakening of the harmony, as the chord is not being reinforced with the root in the bass. It should be noted that many of these concepts are not exclusive to Mike's playing, but rather are activities the entire band engages in. And while it may seem like an oversimplification to reduce the band's improvisational language to just a few possibilities, as Gordon said, there are all varieties of that, from same to different. Musical agreement and disagreement exist on a spectrum. Mike could be slightly disagreeing harmonically by largely playing notes that support the tonality, but with occasional notes from outside of the chord or key. On the other hand, he could be strongly disagreeing harmonically by playing in an entirely different key than Trey or Page. Additionally, it's relatively common for Gordon to be imitating and counterpointing, agreeing and disagreeing at the same time. He could be playing in a way that reinforces the rhythmic groove, but with pitches outside of the current harmony or tonality. Thus, he would be engaging in rhythmic agreement, but harmonic disagreement. Furthermore, he could simultaneously be in rhythmic agreement with Trey, for instance, but rhythmic disagreement with Fishman. While the ideas of agreement and disagreement in Mike's bass lines occur in most jams in varying degrees of prominence, the 17-minute sample in a jar from 8/1/23 at Madison Square Garden provides clear examples of most of the concepts. A blurb about the jam on Phish.net says, "If Phish plays a residency at MSG, chances are you'll want to hear the version of sample they play there. This second set opener is the longest one played to date. Trey and Mike have some fun interplay which sets the tone for the jam." The band plays the song proper as one would expect, but after the guitar solo, which usually ends the song, they hang on a D major chord before shifting into a D Mixolydian mode to begin the jam. For the first 14 measures, Mike plays almost exclusively ascending lines, usually rising from D up through 1 or 2 octaves before skipping back down to begin another ascent. He makes 9 ascents of varying metric lengths in this passage, from 2 beats up to 7.5 beats. These ascents serve multiple purposes. One, they reinforce the harmony or modality because he's essentially playing scales with occasional chromatic passing tones. It's a way of saying, here is the collection of pitches we're going to use. Generally, he's playing in harmonic agreement with Trey and Page. Secondly, these ascending scales begin the jam with metric disagreement, as they rarely begin or end on a strong beat in the measure. While he maintains the basic pulse of the groove, he makes no attempt to conform to any meter or time signature. In the recording we'll listen to, I've doubled Mike's bass with my own and turned it up quite high so we can hear it clearly, but still hear how it operates in the context of the jam. At 5 minutes and 26 seconds in the jam, Mike plays a short riff in a tenor register. It sounds similar to the tune of On Broadway, which is appropriate for a show at MSG. In the example, this short figure and variations of it are in purple. In the recording, notice how quickly Trey reacts to Mike's riff. He immediately tries to mimic it, but it takes him a couple of tries to get it right. Trey's mimicry is not of the taboo type discussed earlier, but rather the yes-and type, picking up on a melodic theme and then developing it. Trey and Mike continue to return to this figure as a melodic theme into the 8th minute of the jam.
Can we turn it up a little?
Can you turn this up? Trey mimics it. At 7:22, Mike plays the on-Broadway motive again, but shifts the mode to D minor. This momentarily creates a harmonic disagreement as the others are still in D Mixolydian. At this point, there are three possible futures. One, the others refuse to move to minor, but Mike stands his ground and they play in different modes. This is kind of an unlikely future. Two, the others refuse to move to minor, and Mike relents, returning to D Mixolydian. Or three, the others follow him to D minor, thereby regaining harmonic agreement. The uncertainty only lasts a few seconds, as Trey and Page choose option 3, quickly joining Mike in D minor after only 2 measures. Apparently, however, D minor was not Mike's ultimate goal. Only 7 seconds after Trey and Page join him there, Gordon begins trying to move the pitch center to F, but this time the others are unwilling to follow, likely thinking we just got here. Mike then retreats, joining the others back on D momentarily. But Gordon is both patient and persuasive. As Trey said, Mike has a funny way of getting what he wants. After almost a minute of alternately asserting D and F as the tonal home, Mike entices the rest of the band to follow him to F at 8:24. They will remain in the key of F until the end of the jam, 8 minutes later. After establishing F as the new key center for about 20 seconds, Page introduces a new chord progression, F to B flat. This is the 1-4 progression mentioned earlier as one of Page's go-tos. A couple minutes later, again on Page's initiative, the F to B flat chord alternation becomes E flat, B flat, F. Mike sometimes supports these chords by playing the root on the beat of the chord change, harmonic and metric agreement. But just as often, he opts to either play chord tones other than the root, pedal the F, or reharmonize the progression by playing notes outside of the chords. The colors in the example correspond to varying degrees of harmonic agreement and disagreement as each chord change occurs. We only heard a short excerpt, but this chord pattern repeats 59 times from 11 minutes to 16:21. Mike, though, only supports the entire progression with roots on the beat 5 times. Continually changing how he harmonizes the chords achieves multiple effects. 1, it keeps the progression from becoming monotonous, and 2, it provides a certain amount of harmonic tension, which he can then occasionally release by playing the chord roots. The final time he supports each chord with the root and the bass at 16:21 seems to signal to the band that it's time to move on. The jam quickly winds down and they prepare to segue into Kill Devil Falls. One other area of interest in this jam occurs at 13:29. At this point, Page plays a jaunty rhythm on piano. Trey hears Page's idea and mimics it in the very next bar, joining Page but up a third. After hearing Page and Trey play the motive, Mike then jumps on the rhythm in the third bar of the example. He doesn't play it exactly the same at first, but it clearly supports the new motive. In the 4th and 5th measures, Trey, Page, and Mike play the motive in rhythmic unison, with Mike adding it a 4th below Page. Then, in the final measure, all 3 play variations of the motive and prepare to move on. Though this entire passage lasts only a few seconds, we see again how carefully they're listening to each other and how quickly they react to what the others play. This is imitation both in the agreement sense and, incidentally, in the musicological sense. While it involves a certain amount of mimicry, again, it's the I hear you or yes and type. They hit on it long enough to all do it in unison, but leave it before they get stuck in a repetitive rut. In the first few minutes of this jam, Mike initiated most of the changes. He instigated the on-Broadway motive. He changed the mode from D mixolydian to D minor, and he moved the pitch center from D to F. Phish jams are not a one-sided conversation, though. Everyone has an opportunity to contribute musical ideas or reject ideas offered by another member. Once the band was in F, it was Page who suggested the E-flat, B-flat, F progression that most of the remainder of the jam would utilize. Fishman, too, made musical suggestions that became integral to the jam. At 8:30, he suggested a syncopated rhythm, accenting the last 16th note of the first beat of each measure. The red notes in the example demonstrate Mike's metric agreement with Fishman's syncopation. And in fact, the whole band quickly latched onto it, like snapping to a grid. This syncopation would be a significant part of the groove for the last 8 minutes of the jam. While Trey seems to be the lead instrument, providing the primary melodic voice, much of the musical material in the jam was generated by the other members. The concept of imitating versus counterpointing, agreeing versus disagreeing, can take many forms. We might be inclined to think that the jams that are most satisfying are ones in which the band members are largely agreeing with each other. But total agreement is likely to result in a jam that stays type 1, never veering too far from the original groove of the song. For a jam to move into type 2 territory, some level of disagreement must occur. Mike makes an interesting observation in an online tour journal from summer 2014 saying, Fishman has been listening back to a lot of our gigs and noticed that when it's really happening, we are not always hitting together. Mike's capital letters. I'm guessing that one reason is that each person is true to their own groove, which is important. Like each groove having a deep commitment to its own swing, even if it doesn't line up exactly with the others. Mike recognizes that agreement is not the only means of achieving musical bliss. The exploratory parts of jams where the band ventures into new territory can only happen with some degree of disagreement or counterpointing. The times when it's really happening are more likely to come about through disagreement rather than universal agreement. Though my analysis focused specifically on this one sample jam, the concepts I discussed appear regularly in Phish's improvisations. If you're unaccustomed to singling out Mike's bass lines in order to think about his role in a jam, but are interested to try, the fundamental question is pretty simple. Is Mike playing with other members of the band, or is he playing against them? Is he imitating or counterpointing? In all likelihood, he will be doing them both simultaneously, residing somewhere in the realm of all varieties of that, from same to different. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. We have about 10 minutes left for questions for Rob. If you have a question, please come down to the microphones here. One thing I want to note is just how the agency that Mike has, because he's the bass, and the different way that Mike has, the different power that Mike has in directing the music, because he's the bass and that's the foundational, that provides the foundational harmonic grounding for everything.
Yeah, and we even saw that this morning in the Birds of a Feather jams. Like, there was the part where the band was basically in this kind of E-flat minor or pentatonic jam. Mike basically just changed the root. He went to G-flat and totally just changed the pitch center, made it a G-flat major jam instead of an E-flat minor jam. The others don't have to change notes at all. But Mike, moving his pitch center, changes the key of the jam.
But it also makes, he has more ability to, I think, if he disagrees with you, you have less power to say, well, I think this is the way, like Mike can single-handedly make a decision that the other two pitch instruments, Trey and Page, have to follow, because if Trey and Page want to play in one key, but Mike wants to play in another key,
whatever Mike plays is the key they're in.
Sure. So in a way, he maybe has to be more conscious of that ability that he has to really direct things.
With great power.
Great power, great responsibility. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. This really has me thinking also about groove and groove texture, and this idea of agreement and disagreement as it might relate to something like a syncopated groove texture. So I'm wondering if you could either thinking with that, like, do you have thoughts on how different styles they might be engaging in, how that determines this sort of decision making or this sort of denial or agreement, or imitating or counterpointing? Like, also, for example, at the end of that jam, I heard like Trey was totally also in counterpoint with Mike. They had this little question and answer thing. I'm thinking more in terms of like the typical type of Western counterpoint, kind of stuff, like a 2-verse-1. But anyway, I was just wondering if you had thoughts on how the style they may be engaging in directs this sort of agreement, or the level at which that might be present.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there probably are certain styles that sort of lend themselves more to Mike, like rhythmically disagreeing. And then something like Gada Jabu or Sand, and a lot of those jams, Mike's just repeating the same thing over and over again. Like, he never gets off of that initial groove. And it's sort of special when he does. Like, the jam kind of opens up. There are probably, other than that, I can't think of specific examples, but there are those tunes that sort of must lend themselves better to Mike exploring different kind of like rhythmic interpretations of the groove.
Yeah, and that also, go ahead, I'm sorry. I was just saying that also kind of gets me thinking about how affect might be generated in the moment, right? Like, and this goes along with like expectations and capitulation or denial of expectations, where, sometimes that, like with Sand, the disagreement is like creates this big effective moment, whereas other times it is the agreement that creates that highly effective moment, of union on a big structural downbeat or something like that.
Definitely. And also, like when Mike is repeating that line over and over again, that creates a different kind of tension. Like, I'm talking about this in terms of agreement and disagreement, but tension and release also makes sense, or consonance and dissonance. Repeating that line, that sort of Sand groove or the Gada Jabu groove over and over again creates its own kind of tension. That sometimes it's often ends up being the other players who kind of get to release the tension by then agreeing or disagreeing.
I was going to piggyback your comment because you made me think about tonality, right? So I wonder if we even dove in to see like when they're approaching either major or minor, when they're in major and someone tries to go to minor, is there more incidences of that? Because I don't know, I love dark, scary Phish, right? And if they even go close, I'm like, yes, like continue. And then usually it's Mike or, actually probably more Trey, who's like, no. And they move on back to whatever key area they're in. And so I wonder, it might be interesting to see like in different songs? How many times do they agree to go to like a dark, scary minor jam versus a different key area?
Yeah.
And while I have the mic, I just wanted to say, this was so nicely put together.
Oh, thank you.
My one other question is, so it seems that they're not imitating Mike's fashion choices, right? Like,
Yeah,
they're not
that didn't
following-
catch on for some reason. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's so funny. I wrote during Blake's presentation, because you mentioned like if you break the rules too much, if you break the rules, it can create excitement, but you can't do it all the time. And I literally wrote down like when sample jams, not knowing that you were talking about sample jamming in your presentation. So that happened. That's totally normal and happens all the time with us. But it does, there's a sort of tying those two together. I'm thinking about Mike has said in an interview recently, I think it was an Instagram thing recently or something I saw online, where he was like, yeah, so, we'll be jamming and then we'll go to 4 because, that's a thing that we do all the time or something like that, and he kind of made the point that like, yeah, Phish jams kind of always go 1/4 when they don't have a more interesting idea. This is a really nice example of a very interesting idea where, I think the flat 7/4-1 progression comes in, which has a similar flavor, but it's that,
and is also not uncommon in Phish jams.
No, it's a very
another of their like go-to,
very typical rock jam generally too. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, as a bass player, I mean, thank you, because this was awesome. Let's hear it for the bass. And I think Mike is behind so many of my favorite improvisational moments, and something that Julie said in this last question and even Jake's follow-ups got me thinking about, and it's getting into subjectivity, sure, but like the emotional quotient of some of this stuff. And I think one of the reasons I don't really jibe, I'm a bit of a jaded vet, and that's going to come out tonight at the Haters Ball, I think. But the newer Phish styles, I think the Bliss Jam or whatever we want to call that, does tend to be a little happier, a little more positive. And I think some of the most interesting Mike-led moments for me, the B minor hood, let's have a moment for that. And the music hall melt that I've talked a lot about, he introduces, a relative minor or some kind of minor moment that seems really emotionally and like full of pathos and full of some kind of weight that I think missing. Do you think there's any connection with like emotional resonance and like with any of this stuff? That's a big question.
I'm not sure. I certainly don't know the answer to that. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. But yeah, it does make me think, like, I was noticing on this most recent Mexico run, it felt like there were a lot more kind of dark, scary jams, which I was really excited about. And even in the Sphere, there were a few, and in the this past fall, it's like, more of these kind of weird, dark, creepy moments that, I'm excited to hear some more of those, for sure.
We're actually out of time for questions on this, but if you do continue to have questions for Rob or any of our panelists, please approach them afterwards. Let's give a hand for our panelists one more time.